With Microsoft revealing the new Xbox One X, it's a better time than ever to get into PC gaming, with Phil Spencer, the head of Xbox, attempting to get the two platforms to work seamlessly together. However, for those of you that can't afford the Xbox One X, or don't want to go on the outdated performance of the original Xbox One, we have the meeting point. This is of course the £112 gaming PC. Firstly, we've gone for an Intel DQ57TM motherboard, which is for socket LGA1156. It cost us £30 and allows for a wide range of first-gen i processors to be used, which is the predecessor to Sandy Bridge. IPC wise, we're looking at 30 to 40% worse IPC than that of Skylake/Kaby Lake depending on the type of task we're doing, which is still not bad considering it will blow the water out of the Jaguar cores that the original Xbox One and PS4 consoles used. This brings us on to the next point, which is the processor. We've gone for the Core i3-540, which cost us £3. Now, I mainly bought this to test out the motherboard, but it works so nicely that we're going to use it for the main build. It has 2 cores and 4 threads which come clocked in at roughly 3.1 GHz or 3.06 GHz for those of you that like to be very precise. It has a 73 watt TDP and is based on the 32nm process. Paired with this, we've gone for 6GB of DDR3 1600MHz RAM for £14. It'll only run at 133MHz on this motherboard, but it shouldn't impact performance at all. They did send me one really nice HyperX stick, but the rest are just standard Crucial or Samsung sticks from OEM machines, and nothing really that much I need to complain about. Graphics wise is definitely a big one. From the start of our cinematic style on the channel, we have the GTX 480. It costs us £25 a day and boasts a floating point performance of 1.3 teraflops. It has 1.5GB of VRAM and uses 250 watts of power. It was the most powerful card of 2010 and actually I think it'll hold up pretty well today. Case wise, we have this £10 Cooler Master case from eBay. It has two 120mm fans fitted as well as a hard drive. It was available on eBay, so we put a bid in and got it for £10 as it was collection only. But for that £10 it doesn't seem too bad. It's a little bit beaten up and does come with its very own dead wasp inside. Isn't that lovely? To power this, we have a Corsair TX power supply unit, which I got off eBay for £30 for a bid. I think it was untested, hence the low price, but it works pretty well. Alternatively, Amazon does sell a Corsair VS power supply unit for a similar price, and either of these models will be able to deal with the TDP of the parts we're going to be using today. As for cooling, I had this no-name passive Intel cooler that came with the LGA1156 motherboard I bought. I'm guessing this PC previously had a Pentium dual core in it, as that's the sticker that came on it, and for a cooler I've never seen before, it does look pretty beefy, and more than enough to handle the 73 watts of the Core i3 we're going to be using. So with those parts all sorted, let's get on with building this thing. The CPU slots into the socket in the normal kind of way and is virtually the exact same as Intel's LGA system has been for years. Next of all is the CPU cooler, which uses Intel's amazing clipping system. You know, the one with the really flimsy parts that just tend to break off or bend or just don't work in any way that's helpful at all, and really would just be preferable if they just replaced them with screws or metal clips, but in the end it does kinda work. Next came the RAM, which is fairly self-explanatory as they just clip into the right coloured slots to indicate that they're running in dual channel. After this was done, we turned our attention to the case and the power supply unit. We wanted to thread all the cables through to the back so that could be accessible later on when we needed to plug them all in. The case itself doesn't seem too bad for cable management, it's very reminiscent to the cheaper Corsair cases in terms of cable routing and the actual way the power supply unit is installed. The power supply unit is bottom mounted, so we simply just placed it along the bottom and screwed it in, which is pretty self-explanatory and expected when you screw in a power supply, I suppose. Before we put the motherboard in, we needed to fit the I/O shield, which just clipped in. It was a little bit loose, but whether this was because of the shield or the case's fault, I don't really know. The motherboard just places right up against it and screws down. We were missing a few of the standoffs, but there were more than enough present to prevent any damage to the motherboard or the case. Next of all came the graphics card, which is probably one of the largest I actually own, so it's quite nice that it fits inside the case. We then plugged in all the various cables such as the 24 pin, the 4 pin, the 8 pin, the 6 pin, And I think that's all of them actually, that's quite exciting going through that list. Then it was a matter of the front panel, the USB and the audio ports. Unfortunately, we can't plug in the USB 3.0 connection as the motherboard lacks this connectivity, but this can be resolved with an adapter which costs just about probably less than that, about £5, maybe £3 on Amazon. Hard drive wise, we tucked the cables round the back and mounted it in the front. We simply plugged the SATA cable into the only SATA 3 port the motherboard has, and after this we pushed some of the cables round the back into the little space we had left for cable management, and in the end it didn't look too bad. And so there we have it, it's probably the best value build I've done to date. Of course we're opting again to install Windows 7 64-bit as it's relatively easy to install and I have it on hand from previous builds, so without further ado let's get on with installing that. Windows is being installed from a memory stick as it seems to be the best way to go about it, and with how easy that build was, installing a Windows was exactly the same story. There were no errors, slowdowns or issues at all, so for ease of use so far this has been one of the best builds I've ever done, especially considering how cheap it is. And now with that all installed and done, with drivers installed etc, it's time to get on with some benchmarks. Up first is Grand Theft Auto 5, which is running in the 1080p resolution with high settings selected. It ran flawlessly on the system, outpacing that of the Xbox One or PS4 consoles thanks to that boost in visual fidelity and frame rate. It ran with averages of 48 frames per second, dropping down to 38 frames per second when there was a lot going on. It's safe to say that this is the CPU's fault, but regardless of this, the experience was definitely more than playable. Moving on to CSGO returned us with averages of 93 frames per second and lows down to 64 when the game got tough. It was more than playable overall and was run with medium settings in the 1080p resolution. Lowering the settings a bit may yield you a small increase, but personally it wasn't worth the drop in quality. Fallout 4 here, with the high settings selected in the 1080p resolution, gave us a great experience. The game ran with averages of 40 FPS and minimums down to 28 FPS when a lot was going on. However, in the quieter areas in the game would run at a locked 60 FPS, so not only did it look amazing, it ran great. Doom, on the other hand, the newest game we'll be testing, was running with a mixture of medium and high settings in the 1080p resolution. It yielded us a very similar experience with 38 FPS averages and minimums of 27 FPS when there was a lot going on. Lowering these settings a bit would achieve you a solid 60 FPS though. As for early access titles up next, we've chosen The Forest. It runs pretty nicely with the high settings considering how taxing the game can be. It got us an average of 42 FPS and lows down to 31 FPS when a lot was going on. Definitely not bad for such a cheap PC. Finally, we tested out Mad Max, which is being run in the high settings. We saw averages of 64 frames per second and lows down to 58 FPS when there was a lot going on. So this PC is pretty much capable of playing the latest releases with high settings enabled in the 1080p resolution. As for recording, we ran OBS to encode in the 720p resolution and a bitrate of 2500 kilobits a second. The recording turned out okay, but game performance did suffer a bit with it dropping down to 40 frames per second, which is definitely still a playable experience, but not really what you want if you're going to be streaming or recording competitive gameplay. But in those older or simpler titles, recording and streaming would definitely be possible. So sure, it's not the best PC, but personally it doesn't have to be. This PC can handle everything that I do on my main PC at a fraction of the cost, and I'd still choose it over a console any day. Thank you very much for watching. Good night. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this, and thank you to those of you that already have. If you'd like to help support the channel more, don't forget we have a Patreon which is linked down below.